National Renewable Energy Laboratory. As one might expect, there are many non-profit organizations of different types that make important contributions to the quest for clean energy: government agencies, NGOs, trade associations, etc. The handful of such groups that have contributed to this book speak to the important work they are doing to develop key technologies and to adopt rational policy by which renewables can be moved forward in a concerted and responsible way. We begin with National Renewable Energy Laboratory. NREL is the only federal laboratory dedicated to the research, development, commercialization and deployment of renewable energy and energy efficiency technologies. I was delighted to speak with spokesperson George Douglas. Craig Shields, my readers and I would love to know more about NREL. Perhaps we could start with an introduction? George Douglas: Sure. NREL began its life in 1977 as the Solar Energy Research Institute, or SERI, on the heels of the first set of OPEC oil embargoes. It was founded to explore how to convert energy from the sun into usable energy. That started to be more broadly translated fairly quickly to include wind energy and energy from biomass. During the first Bush administration, SERI was elevated to national laboratory status and named the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which is what it is today, to reflect the broader mission of the place. CS, wouldn't most Americans have said, well, technology is typically developed in the private sector? What was the impetus? What was the thought process behind doing this in the public sector? GD, well, the first statement is not true. How did we get to the moon? Public sector development of technology. The Internet is public sector development of technology. Really, the model that people think about is the Bell Labs model, the long-term investment in technology. But after the Second World War, business itself became much more increasingly interested in short-term returns. And the role of government in investing in high-risk and long-term research was given a great deal of credibility during the Second World War. The development of radar, development of nuclear arms, and so forth, specifically aimed at harnessing nuclear power. So Oak Ridge National Laboratory, Sandia National Laboratory, Los Alamos, etc. all grew out of that. So, there has been, at least for the last 60 to 70 years, the divide between what research is generally pursued by private enterprise and what research is pursued by the government and in academia. It's the difference between near-term results, and by near-term, I don't mean tomorrow, but in the 10 to 20-year time horizon, and much longer-term problems and results. CS, yes. Well, those are excellent points. Thanks for clearing that up for me. GD, so, NREL was one of the later of the national laboratories, and our only mission is energy efficiency and renewable energy, although other national labs have energy efficiency and renewable energy as parts of their portfolio. CS, okay. Well, here's another thing that typical Americans may think. And maybe we're wrong here too, and that is that the Bush administration 43 did pretty much nothing to forward an energy efficiency agenda, and now all of a sudden there is a great deal of renewed interest and activity in this. Is that true? GD, only partly. Through 2005, and early in 2006, the Bush administration's attention to energy started to include, in a much more robust way than previously, renewable energy and energy efficiency as well. In the State of the Union address in 2005, President Bush talked about producing cars that run on hydrogen. In 2006 he went further and in the State of the Union address talked about things that sounded like nonsense to me, among other things saying that we could make ethanol from switchgrass, which brought the great John Stewart diagram of a switchgrass processing device, which as the camera pulled away remarkably resembled the bong. It was kind of funny. But also, President Bush visited this lab on President's Day of that same year. At that point, just prior to that, NREL had been faced with layoffs. For us that was sort of a turning point. President Bush came here, held a little panel discussion, a town hall meeting style, and a great deal of publicity ensued. And what followed from there were a couple of specific things. We opened a new laboratory building and then the following year, got funding to equip the building. And have been on a track of rapid expansion since then. CS, great. In your estimation, what are your 2 or 3 most likely projects that will move the needle in a big way in the coming decades or so? GD, one would certainly be cellulosic ethanol. We think that the science and engineering are very much on track for producing billions of gallons of cellulosic ethanol in the next 10 years. And that would be significant. The second thing that seems to be moving fairly rapidly is thin cell photovoltaics. The potential for thin cell in PV has long been that it can be manufactured less expensively, more easily installed, in a wider range of places, that sort of thing. The problem has been its efficiency, which remains lower than we'd like. It just takes a large investment to make plants that can produce huge sheets of semiconductor material. But progress has been pretty rapid on both fronts, increasing the efficiency with better technology on the manufacturing side. It seems like a lot of venture capital type money is flowing in that direction these days. So those 2 things particularly look very good. CS, excellent. You raise an interesting question when you say venture capital money, that is, private. So you're suggesting that the private and the public sectors collaborate on projects like these. Tell me about that, please. GD, yes, that's what we do all the time. NREL runs, for example, an incubator program. Federal money in there right now is in the tens of millions of dollars, for photovoltaics, in which promising companies get a boost in federal money, which provides them with both some money to live to fight another day, and also a credential they've been reviewed by us, and found worthy. CS, like Solyndra? GD, Solyndra is a good example. And so then those companies can take that credential and go raise private money. CS, I understand. That makes a lot of sense. GD, so we do that. We also have a number of what we call CRADAs, Cooperative Research and Development Agreements, with a variety of private companies, both big and small, on a variety of projects. We will give out 3 R&D 100 awards this year, which is not an unusual year for us. All of those awards are given for technologies, the 100 most promising technologies. And for all of those awards that are given, there has to be a product. And of course NREL doesn't make products, so there has to be an industry partner. Sky Fuels is one of our partners. We developed together a polymer coating for concentrating solar power, solar thermal electric, with great promise. It doesn't involve glass, so it's less heavy, it's less expensive to make, it's easier to install, and so forth. And so Sky Fuels is looking for a market. And I think they'll find it too. These are the kinds of things we do at all kinds of levels of involvement with companies. We license our technologies. And like I said, we work in CRADAs with companies. We do work for others where we might have facilities or equipment that would be very expensive to duplicate. But we can put together an agreement in which some of the information that comes out is proprietary and some of the information that comes out is public. Our interests tend to be in the basic science side, so if some basic science is being worked on, if there is some knowledge or discoveries we think has a benefit to all levels, and the company sees some benefit that specifically has to do with their proprietary process, then that makes a nice marriage. CS, I just had a conversation with an extremely senior guy who was talking about biofuels and I said, all things being equal, wouldn't we rather be going in a direction that isn't trading in one form of hydrocarbons for another? He thought I was an idiot to ask such a question. But, where did I go wrong there? If you had a choice between solar thermal, concentrating solar power, and switchgrass, wouldn't you prefer the former? GD, sure, except for the infrastructure. The infrastructure for personal transportation is all based on liquid fuels. And it's huge. Trillions of dollars worth of infrastructure. Changing that's not an overnight process. So, things are working in parallel. For the liquid fuels infrastructure, ethanol blends in very nicely. We know how to make flex fuel vehicles, we know how to make ethanol-only vehicles. All of those things blend in very nicely. However, at the same time, we are working on plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, which is a step towards all-electric vehicles. Now, plug-in hybrids require some liquid fuels. And so, if the goal is to use less imported petroleum, which is the stated goal, then a much quicker path to that is to start incorporating more and more homegrown fuel in the liquid fuel supply. For most personal transportation, you can probably get to electric at some point. But to go to electric right now, there is a range problem, and a charging infrastructure problem, and a refuel time problem. And those are insurmountable. Scientists are optimists in general, and everybody thinks that we'll eventually have better batteries. The batteries today are better than they were 10 years ago, and 10 years from now they will be better still. But ethanol could be blended into the liquid fuel system pretty much right now. Having said that, there are some problems. With ethanol you can't run it through a petroleum pipeline, for instance, so you still have a transportation problem. You'd either have to build dedicated pipelines or do what they do now, and ship it by rail or by truck. So there is a proximity problem, there is optimization of engines to better use ethanol. Flex fuel is like the worst of both worlds in many ways. But those problems seem more quickly solved than the problems for all-electric vehicles. There is a vast agricultural market in this country that can grow everything we need to make ethanol. CS, well, you bring up an interesting point. And again, I'll go back to what my particular take on the typical American's viewpoint is, and in this case it's not very kind. I think that most people think that corn ethanol in particular is one of the biggest disasters, and in fact I'll go so far as to call it a malicious disaster, ever perpetrated on the American taxpayer. We could have known, or probably did know going in, that there is no advantage to doing this. By the time you end up irrigating and fertilizing and harvesting and processing uncountable of acres of corn, not to mention the fact that there's interruption of the food supply, you have a considerable negative net gain. But I don't think it's a technological issue. I think it's perceived more as a political issue. In other words, if it weren't for extremely powerful senators in the Corn Belt, this wouldn't have happened in a million years. GD, maybe, maybe not. The one thing to keep in mind, and again this isn't our argument, But one thing to keep in mind is that if the goal is to reduce the use of petroleum, then corn ethanol is a substitute for petroleum. If that's the goal, to reduce the use of petroleum, and thus reduce the use of imported petroleum, which is really the goal, then corn ethanol does that. If the goal is to have a lot of cheap corn ethanol doesn't help there either. But if the goal is to reduce the amount of petroleum you're importing for use in transportation, then corn ethanol definitely accomplishes that goal. CS. Well, can you speak to the idea of reducing our dependency on foreign oil? If it was sincere, what about the first 6 years of the Bush administration? Why haven't we done more, if we are sincere about cutting our dependence on foreign oil? GD. Well, you're asking me for a political argument. That really isn't something that a laboratory does. That said, let me say this. If you took a graph of this lab's budget and overlaid it with a graph of the price of a barrel of petroleum, you would see that the higher the price of oil, the more money the laboratories got. The lab got a lot of funding during the Carter administration when oil was expensive. In the Reagan administration, particularly in the latter part of the Reagan administration, when the Soviet Union started pumping lots of oil into the US and the OPEC cartel fell and we ultimately had among the lowest gas prices ever was when our severest cuts were. CS. Okay. So you're suggesting that there is in fact pretty decent sincerity. You're suggesting that there is no reason to be suspicious of the sincerity of this claim. GD. I'm saying that the sincerity of the claim has had, I won't speak for now, but has had more to do with the price of petroleum than the geopolitical situation. That seemed to change somewhat after 9/11. Now the concern may be higher on the national security side than on the economic side. We're starting to rise, almost, not higher than, but starting to. CS. Well, do you know James Woolsey? GD. Right, I do know James Woolsey. CS. Well, you know that he puts forward 7 or 8 reasons for moving away from fossil fuels, each pretty much independent of the rest. And I see his point. As a loyal, tax-paying American, I don't understand why this is at all controversial. GD. Well, there's no political vote for suffering. I mean, the real way to reduce consumption of petroleum is to raise the price. We know that. I mean, when the price went up to $5 a gallon a year and a half ago, consumption immediately dropped. Immediately. So, if the government was to say we are going to reduce the consumption of petroleum, slap a $3 tax on it and that would do. Now, you find a congressman who's willing to propose that. So many people find merit in your argument. But the political will to get there is a more difficult thing. What we want, or what seems to be wanted, is this progress without pain. And technical solutions sometimes offer that. CS. Well, let me ask you this. If you're big energy, say ExxonMobil or Chevron, you don't want renewable energy to happen and you spend a lot of cycles both hidden and obvious to throw monkey wrenches into the works of clean energy. An example might be Exxon saying, okay, we won't fund sham research projects that try to discredit global warming. GD. I've seen the kind of evidence that you are citing, but from NREL's point of view, what we see is increasing interest and cooperation from large corporations including big energy corporations. We have quotas with Chevron, we have quotas with BP. In addition to them, Dow and 3M, these are corporations who I think are beginning at least to see themselves as energy companies, not oil companies. Chevron is involved with us in a quota researching algae oils. So the potential there is enormous. and that you could make an oil, a petroleum substitute, from algae. Actually, algae makes the oil. You just harvest it. And the chevron side of this whole thing is the processing of it. We can grow algae that makes oil. Not a lot, but we can do it. But once you got the algae oil, you've got to turn it into a product. And Chevron's very good at turning oil into products. And so, that's their interest. The fact that Chevron's money is in it, it's not a lot, but several $1 million, is an indication that they're interested. CS, well, certainly if somebody's going to do it, and I guess Chevron's board of directors said, look, somebody's going to do this, so why shouldn't it be us? GD, I think that lots of things have moved forward in the last 10 years that the general public perception is probably behind the curve on, because it takes a long time for old truths to become new truths. And so there's long been this sort of oil conspiracy theory, that there is some guy with a garage in Arizona who can make rocket ships out of water, all that sort of stuff, which a certain group of people, I suppose, believe. But there is also the sort of notion that progress is being made more slowly than it should be. And that maybe more slowly than it should be may be true, but it's not more slowly than most technology curves. So what people don't tend to recognize is that they've got an iPhone now because it came from the development of technology. They think that just suddenly, here is a phone that will do all these amazing things on the marketplace, but the basis of that technology goes back 60 or 70 years. And the curve gets more rapid as things develop. Sort of like Moore's law. But in renewable energy, we're not at that point in the curve. But that point will arrive. I mean, you can look at the history of lots and lots of technologies, including what we would call ancient technology like steam engines, and the curve is the same. When you consider the discovery and its usefulness over time, it's really incredibly similar. And so, no one has any reason to believe that, for example, the efficiency of photovoltaics, the ability to put photovoltaics on flexible and different materials, the cost of photovoltaics, won't follow a very similar curve to other technologies. Same with cellulosic ethanol. CS, great analysis. Thanks. And I guess what readers want to know, just to end off on this political point of view, I guess readers just want to know, is this happening in good faith? In other words, if this is slower than everybody wants, but everybody's trying and nobody is deliberately sabotaging this effort, just because they have an interest in doing so, that's fine. But here's the problem, there have been examples of that in American commerce. Efforts to sabotage progress surface all the time. But I think people want to know, is there a real sincere effort that is being essentially undeterred by powerful corporations who have extremely clear-cut missions to sabotage it? GD, well, what I'm saying is that we work with, have worked with, continue to work with, and at an increasing rate, with traditional energy companies. CS, okay, well that's good to know. GD, you know, things gather up steam and at some point, and I'm not trying to say that this is all what happened, but at some point it may look like the development of a new technology or a different political look at things is bad for your business. And so you resist it. And then there comes a point when you've lost that game. Things are shifting. And they're beyond your control. And smart businesses figure out a way to change from making leather saddles to making leather seats for cars. CS, yes, exactly. If you can't beat them, join them, in other words. GD, yes. Figure out how your business model can match into that business model. And I think we're seeing an awful lot of that. I read comments almost every day where somebody says we believe a carbon penalty is coming. It looks like it might be cap and trade, could be a tax, whatever. The guy who is making electricity from coal is going to have to deal with it. And the guy who makes gasoline, he's going to have to deal with it. And there are all sorts of ways to deal with it. You can raise your prices, you find a cheaper way to make your product, you can switch technologies. I mean, it's just constant that you see that. Well, 5 years ago, oh no. A carbon penalty will cripple the economy. Can't have such a thing. Now, you still hear that from some people, but most people in business, what you hear is it's inevitable. We are coping. So there's been a shift. CS, yep, I'm with you. Now let me ask you one final question, if I may. Every time I hear about renewable energy, the idea that we need a mix seems to be a foregone conclusion. We have wind in the plains, we have solar thermal in the desert, we've got geothermal in the mountains, and all of these things are a good thing and they add up. You don't want all your eggs in one basket, etc. I'm wondering, if I were the king of the world, what's the matter with putting a huge set of solar thermal farms in the otherwise completely worthless land in the southwestern deserts and building out the grid with high voltage DC and storing the energy, as required anyway, with molten salt? What's the matter with just studying the problem and picking the best solution? GD, well, a couple of things. First, I'd advise you not to go to Barstow and say that the desert is worthless. CS, well, that's a good point. I have to stop being that cavalier. GD, I'm not sure that there is absolutely enough resource. I don't know if water is an issue or not. NREL doesn't think that that's the wisest course for a couple of reasons, though it could be done. One is that it would require a great deal of super transmission, which would cost a great deal of money. So somebody has to say that they are willing to invest in a 20-year transmission build-out. And that's, well, in our view that should be done anyhow. CS, yes, well that's what I was going to say. That probably needs to be done anyhow. GD, committing to one technology. I don't know. I suppose that your idea is not necessarily a bad one, but we think a better one is diverse resource. There are security reasons for that. There is also the notion of locally generated power that generates local jobs and a variety of other things. So there's some economic considerations. We think it would be less expensive overall. CS, oh, okay. I would have thought the opposite, by the way. I would have thought that the concept of scale would have suggested that choosing one as opposed to many was, all things being equal, a good idea. GD, I think that is valid to a point, but not after it. I think the economics of locally produced and used power reduces need for storage and other very expensive portions of the power grid. I mean, storage right now is extraordinarily expensive. So, you know, storage could be cheap in the future but right now it's very expensive. CS, right. Well, I think the thing about molten salt I like is that it really does have the potential to change that equation, and especially if you're talking about solar thermal, which is already heat energy in the first place. GD, right. We are very fond of CSP, concentrating solar power, with storage. There is a water issue there. And it's not nearly as intensive as agriculture, but it is more intensive than, say, a coal-fired power plant. And the desert Southwest is a place where there's not as much water as you'd like there to be. Now there's technology being worked on that. There's air cooling and other kinds of technology that's being worked on to reduce the amount of water used, but again, water is the cheapest way to cool right now. There was an article in Scientific American a couple years ago that was very big on using lots and lots and lots of CSP as a wedge, a climate wedge. But generally speaking, we are, as a laboratory, not sold on any current technology as a 100%, or even 10%, solution. A couple of things happen if you commit to a specific technology. One is that you stop exploring other ideas and such. CS, well, that's a good point. GD, now, if I were a utility, say, and I needed to make a lot of carbon-free electricity, and I could get a hunk of land in the desert Southwest that was the size of Dallas Air Force Base and start building them there, and at all the capital I could come up with and could convince the government to build a lot of transmission out of there, I might do that. Because with, I don't know, 10 years of concerted investment, I could start making money and make a lot of it. Just like building a coal-fired power plant, or a nuclear plant, as a better example really, because the risk is that high. But as a research institution, our notion is that all of these things can have their place and there may not be any clear winner because the technology applies best where it's used best. CS, yes. And there are, as you pointed out, individual local political and economic concerns that may trump the idea. You can't have tens of millions of people out of work. You have to figure out what you're going to do with all the people who used to be mining coal, as an example. GD, right, there are those kinds of political and policy concerns, but beyond that there is the elegance of making and using energy as locally as possible. Which obviously has the economic aspect of employing people there and so forth. But also, untease you from a grid system that can easily be brought down. CS, yes, if I were doing this, by the way, it wouldn't be one big square. That's for sure. GD, we use that 100 by 100 square largely with PV, but it works with CSP too, as a demonstration of the rather small amount of land area in the US. But people always misunderstand it. I've almost stopped using it. Because they think that's what you want to do. CS, right. Now, you've mentioned the oil and national security issue, but you haven't talked too much about global climate change. What's your position on this? GD, I'm concerned that the amount of carbon in the atmosphere is going to affect the climate, yes. And that concern is of course shared by nearly all today. CS, you say nearly all, yet about a year ago it seemed like it was damn near all. It sounds like there's been a little bit of backpedaling. Can you explain that? GD, economics, I think. That's my opinion anyway. I think what happens is everybody says we need to do something about the amount of carbon we're putting into the atmosphere. Then the things that we need to do are starting to get some pushback. And I don't think it's a bad thing, actually, the pushback. You get some pushback that tends to be based in can we afford it? It's not necessarily a bad thing because it makes people go back and look at the cost of the technology. You can get all starry-eyed about putting PV on every roof in America, but when you look at the costs of putting PV on every roof in America, then you've got to wonder where the money will come from. And NREL was the lead author on a study called 30-Year Wind Study. It's 20% wind by 2030. And study asked, is this possible? And the answer to that was yes. And then it asked, well, what are the challenges to getting there? And a big challenge is just building enough manufacturing facilities. So the biggest challenge is transmission, but one of the top 5 was just building enough places to make wind turbines. And that would be the same of any technology you chose. CS. Oh, I'm sure of that. The thing about solar thermal, when you think about it, you try to envision a square of that stuff 110 miles on a side. That's a lot of concrete and aluminum and glass. GD, that's right. So it's a huge endeavor no matter what you do. And then the other thing that I think many people sort of lose sight of is that the energy system we have today, in the developed world, not just in the US but in the entire developed world, is incredibly successful. We lose. I know that the banking industry would like it to be 9 nines, 99.999%, but it's like 5 nines right now. And in math, for any system to work that well is pretty amazing. And then, the cost. The average US electricity cost is something like 9 cents a kilowatt hour. It's nothing. And to think that this is the system that we are trying to somehow replace is daunting. Because it's not like taking something that's terribly broken and fixing it. CS, well, I would say that it's broken, but most people don't see how broken it is. Most people don't figure that their father who just died of cancer probably died because of something associated with the way we generate energy or grow our food or both. GD, yeah, all of those externalities are prices we've long paid. I mean, not just with the electricity system. I mean, our life expectancy was a lot less than 50 years or 100 years ago before we had an electric grid than it is today. I mean, the environmental consequences of being alive have long been harsh. And they're less harsh today, and electricity is part of the reason why. And so, even though the system is not perfect, it is so by far. The fact that I can go in and get my heart operated on, or my lungs, or whatever it was that you were thinking of causing this, is due to electricity. CS, that's absolutely right. That's a very good point. GD, so these kinds of things, I guess what my point is, the point I'm trying to make, is this is a system that works very well. It's not all perfect, but it works very well, and very cheaply, for most people. And there's a great deal of resistance to making it work less well and more expensively in the name of some risk that's in the far future and intangible. CS, it's intangible, and it's coming under fire too. In other words, there are people who believe that global warming is a hoax. I'm not one of them, but you hear that all the time. GD, yes, there are. Most people just aren't thoughtful about it. They just don't pay attention. And why would they? I do because it's my job, but I don't pay attention to a lot of other things. CS, well, this has been fascinating. You don't happen to know the name Peter Lilienthal, ex-NREL researcher, do you? GD, yeah, I know Peter. CS, oh, good. I've been speaking with him on this hybrid power management thing. GD, he's got a lot to talk about there. CS, oh yeah, he's amazing. He's a wonderful guy. And the reason I bring him up is because he was the first guy who really started going through this cost argument with me when I started talking about the ideal way of handling this. He goes, look, there's plenty of renewable energy out there. The question is, would you want to pay for it? GD, that's right. And that's the real question that NREL faces. Now keep in mind that NREL does a lot of different things, and one of the things that we do is very basic scientific research. And we have people who work very much in the depths of material sciences and quantum physics and those sorts of things. But a larger task for NREL is trying to develop technologies that we can help move into the marketplace fairly quickly. We have a nanoscience guy who looked at the behavior of the atomic structure of silicon at the nanoscale, and can get, in rare circumstances, this isn't it at all ready for prime time, but they can get 2, and I think even 3, what they call excitons, when a photon of light hits the silicon atom. So, a photon hits it and normally 1 exciton comes out. And the exciton is electricity. CS, yes, I've heard this. GD, okay, so, does this have the potential to double the amount of electricity you can get? Sure it does. Triple, even. But, can it be done in any way other than under an electron microscope with all kinds of special circumstances? Not now. CS, right, I'm with you. GD, so, these are the kinds of things that I think the deep science can bring us. CS, fantastic, thanks so much. This has been of enormous value, and I'm really grateful. GD, please do stay in touch. Good luck with your book. For more information on this contributor, please visit http://2greenenergy.com/ renewable-energy-facts-fantasies/